Well, the president's campaign chairman was hit today immediately after his federal sentencing with an indictment for 16 new felony charges in New York State. Here's my question. Did that indictment include a little bit of a shot across the bow for the president himself? Because to me, as a non-lawyer, it looked that way. Let me show you what I mean, and then we'll actually talk to somebody who will know for sure. You remember that federal prosecutors in New York already named the president as individual number one in 2 campaign finance felonies that were charged in federal court in New York. According to prosecutors, individual 1, aka President Trump, is the person who directed Michael Cohen to commit campaign finance felonies when he directed the hush money payment scheme to 2 women right ahead of the presidential election and the cover-up thereafter. Since those federal prosecutors described the president's conduct that way in court documents, the question that has loomed over the Trump presidency like King Kong hanging off the freaking Empire State Building is whether or not those prosecutors intend to bring felony charges against individual 1 in regard to those crimes, or indeed the question of whether they might already have brought felony charges against individual 1, aka President Trump, in some sort of sealed indictment that we, the public, have not yet seen. In that campaign finance felony scheme, it is not just the president who is personally implicated as the person directing the scheme. The president's business, the Trump Organization, also appears to be implicated in that felony. In those felonies, I should say. Among other things, they falsely described those hush money payments in the Trump Organization's own books as tech services or a legal retainer. Prosecutors explicitly say that those descriptions in Trump Organization records are false. They explicitly describe the Trump Organization sort of cooking their own books that way, using their own business records to disguise the true nature of those payments, which were illegal payments. And after prosecutors went out of their way to describe the Trump Organization having done that, you'd ask former prosecutors, you'd ask experienced defense attorneys, hey, why are these SDNY prosecutors going out of their way to show and describe these false bookkeeping entries at the Trump Organization? And lawyers would tell you, well, yeah, theoretically, that could be a crime too. Falsely recording those records as something they're not, that could be a felony called falsifying business records. Well, to you and me who aren't lawyers, that's not a very famous crime. Falsifying business records, that's not like bank robbery or reckless driving or even hamburglaring, right? I mean, falsifying business records, does anybody ever actually get charged for that? Well, remember I said it is a 16-count indictment today against Paul Manafort in New York? Count 8. Falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 9, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 10, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 11 and count 12 and count 13 and count 14 and count 15. 8 of the 16 felonies Manafort is charged with today in New York State are falsifying business records in the first degree. And falsifying business records is what the Trump Organization is effectively accused by prosecutors already of having done in the felony campaign finance case that is sending Michael Cohen to prison in a matter of weeks, and in which the president is also alleged to have directed the entire criminal scheme. And it's true, there is a federal Justice Department policy that arguably constrains any federal prosecutor from indicting and prosecuting a sitting president. But that federal Justice Department policy doesn't bind state prosecutors whatsoever. And neither state prosecutors nor federal prosecutors are barred from bringing any sort of prosecution against the president's business or against people who work for the president at his business, whether or not they're his children. I mean, is this today New York prosecutors showing the president how to expect this will be done? Joining us once again is Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney in Alabama. Joyce, thank you for sticking with us. I'm wondering what you think about this idea that the state prosecutors are sort of taking aim at the president here and showing the way that state law might produce a prosecution even out of those felony campaign finance charges we already saw against Cohen.
It's very interesting that we're talking really about 3 different prosecutors' offices, at least 3. The Southern District in New York, that's federal prosecutors. Today, we've got charges filed by the Manhattan District Attorney. That's a second office. And then the third office that also appears to be quite interested in the functioning of both the Trump Organization and the foundation is the New York Attorney General's office. These are the folks who've previously caused the foundation to dissolve and who issued subpoenas that were reported yesterday for information about Trump organization deals with Deutsche Bank. So I think it's a safe assumption, I don't know anything specific about this particular case, that these three offices would have some level of communication and contact, that it's not impossible that federal prosecutors, for instance, would use established mechanisms for sharing evidence that they obtained in the grand jury with state prosecutors, that the offices would talk with each other about theories, and that we would see an indictment today on charges that might later be echoed in work being done by another office, which I think is the long-winded way of saying it's entirely possible that this is a signal of something to come in the future.
Joyce Vance, former U.S. Attorney from the great state of Alabama. Joyce, thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for helping us over the course of the day, trying to understand the legal significance of all this stuff that happened today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rachel.
All right. Lots more to come. It was one of those days. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.